Hello, I'm Megan Bever, and I am book review editor for the Journal of the Civil War Era. Today, I am here with George Rable. George Rable is professor emeritus at the University of Alabama. He has written numerous books over his long career, including the Lincoln Prize-winning Fredericksburg. But today, we're here to talk about Professor Rable's newest work, Conflict of Command, George McClellan, Abraham Lincoln, and the Politics of War. It was published by LSU Press in 2023. So welcome, Professor Rable. I'm glad you could join me for this conversation.
Thanks, Megan. Pleasure to be here.
So the pleasure is mine as well. So I will start with a broad question. What made you decide to embark on a study of George McClellan? Why does he need a reappraisal?
Well, I suppose some people would think he doesn't need a reappraisal. I think for many people that study the Civil War, the reputation of McClellan and Abraham Lincoln, for that matter, are kind of set in stone. My own motivation, I wanted to do a biographical study of some sort, and I couldn't come up with really a biography I wanted to do. And so it was hard to tell what to tackle, and so I decided to look at the relationship between Lincoln and George McClellan. Not exactly a new topic. Maybe it's a product of being a student of T. Harry Williams, who had a lot to say on that subject. But anyway, that's what I decided to do. As I say, not a fresh topic, but I thought that perhaps a focus study, one that would look at the evolution of the relationship in detail. And I think some previous works on the short side tried to look at the two men, but I didn't think in sufficient detail. That might work. And I want to emphasize that word might work, because throughout this project, I must say I lack confidence in what I was doing. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it was there, and I persisted, even though I thought about abandoning the whole thing on a couple occasions. And I suppose in some ways I was like McClellan. I lacked confidence in what I was doing. I wasn't very decisive about what I was doing, and so it was something of a struggle. What helped is I finally decided I wanted to focus on the politics of the relationship and not refight the Peninsula Campaign, not refight the Maryland Campaign, etc., but to focus on the politics, rather than military detail, tactics, that sort of thing. As the study itself evolved, I increasingly decided to bring in the press and the soldiers, who had a lot to say about both men and about the politics of the relationship. The old notion of Civil War soldiers as thinking bayonets or voting bayonets is true to a large extent. Officers and enlisted men alike had a lot to say about the relationship between Lincoln and McClellan. They got to see both men with all the troop reviews McClellan did. They got to see both men quite a bit, commented on their appearance, but also commented on what they perceived as each man's approach to the war. The other thing that developed as the study evolved, and I think I would emphasize the word evolved, was I decided that ambition was really the thing that linked both men together. Both Lincoln and McClellan were deeply ambitious in different ways, but still quite ambitious. McClellan for military glory, Lincoln for political success and also saving the Union. You could say McClellan was ambitious for saving the Union as well. So what started out, believe it or not, as a short book, grew. In fact, there's a couple longer versions still on my computer. Mike Parrish and others at LSU Press got me to cut things back a little bit. But I think the length was necessary to look at how the relationship evolved and some of the nuance involved in that it wasn't just a simple story like it's often been portrayed.
So I want to follow up on this notion of saving the Union because, as you pointed out, the both men's ambition comes through in the book, but the importance of saving the Union is that runs through the entire study. So can you talk a little bit more about the specific or the different ways, I should say, that McClellan, Lincoln, and even others are conceptualizing saving the Union? What are their goals here?
Well, I think it's clear that both men sought to save the Union, and at least at the beginning of the war, in remarkably similar ways. Um, Basically, a conciliatory, conservative approach to the war. Lincoln's assumption that the majority of Southerners were really not Confederates, that they were really not committed to secession. And McClellan agreed with that. For example, Lincoln never objected to McClellan's conciliatory policy toward Confederate civilians in Western Virginia. Both men seemed to be on the same page there. The biggest difference, I think, in terms of their views of saving the Union is that Lincoln's views on the matter evolved and McClellan's did not. I mean, McClellan basically had the same view on saving the Union from the beginning to the end. Lincoln did not, and he increasingly came to see emancipation and eventually the use of African American troops as critical to the process of saving the Union. At least some form of emancipation would be necessary for winning the war. Now, McClellan himself, I think, and though the evidence on this is rather limited, I think McClellan himself believed that slavery would not survive the war. He says that on a couple occasions. But he believed that pursuing emancipation during the war was both unnecessary and probably needlessly divisive. And of course, pursuing emancipation was quite divisive, even among Northerners. So I think that's the big difference there. The difference over slavery and over the whole approach to dealing with Confederates and Confederate property, and limiting the destructiveness of the war or the revolutionary character of the war. McClellan's conservative. Lincoln becomes increasingly less conservative on that count.
So this is very much a study of the two men's working relationship. And there's this, I think, and I'm moving away from the book for a little bit, but I think there's this persistent idea in American culture that Lincoln is a master of working with other people. And in particular, he can manage difficult people who don't necessarily get along with each other. That's not quite the Lincoln that we see in your study. We see an ambitious Lincoln, but we don't always see I don't know if a lack of confidence is a way to frame Lincoln as well. But I have a question, not just a comment. But I guess my question is, if we look at his working relationship with McClellan, what do we learn about Lincoln's management style?
Well, I think we learn that Lincoln, like McClellan, had a significant learning curve. Lincoln had virtually no administrative experience before becoming president. McClellan, of course, had never commanded an army of any kind, and certainly armies of the size that he's going to command. So both men are new, and they start out fresh. And naturally, there's a learning curve, and naturally, both stumble. You don't have to denigrate Lincoln. You don't really denigrate Lincoln by saying he made mistakes. Of course he made mistakes. And he learned from those mistakes. McClellan made mistakes and sometimes didn't learn from his mistakes. Though I think we need to realize that both men throughout the war had a large number of people who believed in what they were doing. In hindsight, we think, well, Lincoln's the savior of the Union. That's the end of the story. But a number of people thought McClellan would be savior of the Union, uh, up to and even during the election of 1864. And so Lincoln's views evolved. He becomes much more tough-minded in dealing with generals. I think both men bear some responsibility for the breakdown of their relationship. One of the things I tried to do in the book, and one of the things at least the reviewers seem to think I've accomplished, was I really tried to be fair-minded with both of them and not write a book that either defended Lincoln on all points or defended McClellan on all points, or castigated Lincoln on all points or castigated McClellan on all points. It seemed to me that it's pretty easy for students of the war to rattle off McClellan's failings, right? Excessive caution, secrecy, exaggeration of difficulties, indecisiveness. Easy to do that. Lincoln himself could at times be indecisive, and I think that comes through in the book, including indecisive in dealing with McClellan. Why did he put up with McClellan for so long is a question that a lot of students of the war have asked, and they've said, we just get impatient for Lincoln to finally move against McClellan. And so Lincoln's indecisiveness plays a role. Also, Lincoln allowed generals, including McClellan, to regularly go outside the chain of command. And Lincoln could be oblivious to the limitations of logistics and geography and that sort of thing. He could be impatient. He could believe that generals could achieve things that they probably couldn't achieve. And so both men bear some responsibility, even though I think most students of the war will still come down more positively with Lincoln than McClellan. But the point was to look at the strengths and weaknesses of both without really trying to lay out a lawyer's case for either man. As I say, both new to their jobs. Grant makes this extraordinary statement after the war about McClellan. I ran into it. I was just boggled my mind in some ways, because students of the war have often quoted Grant on McClellan as the great mystery of the war. But then Grant went on to say McClellan's problem was he was so new to what he was doing. The war was new. Everything was new, all the difficulties, political and otherwise. And Grant said that had McClellan sort of moved up as maybe a brigade commander first, a division commander, etc., like others had done, that he would have done as well as anyone in the war, which is an incredible statement coming from Grant. I mean, it's interesting that the Union command, with obviously some notable exceptions, is really not that negative about McClellan. Grant isn't, Sherman isn't, a number of others aren't. So, we use this Lincoln-McClellan story where Lincoln is the wise one and McClellan is indecisive and foolish, and that's the end of the story. We tell that story at our own peril, because that leaves out a lot of important details and the evolution of the relationship between Lincoln and McClellan.
I think that that was one of the theme of contingency was one of the things that I was struck by, reading this. And I know we don't really deal in counterfactuals that much, but I just found myself asking, like, if these two had worked together at a different time in a different place, like what might have happened? So it's really interesting to hear that observation from Grant that that McClellan doesn't have the benefit, or Lincoln either, in this case of time, and the ability to get the feel of the war. So
I think in some ways McClellan would have been much better as general in chief than in command of an army.
that makes a lot of sense.
I mean, there was talk. There was talk even after he was removed from command that maybe that would happen. Of course, there are all these rumors about bringing back McClellan, but I think they might have been able to work together. McClellan blew hot and cold on Lincoln. We remember the acerbic comments he makes on Lincoln, but there are times when he really kind of respects and gets along with Lincoln. So it's an odd relationship. And of course, each men have their own, psychological difficulties.
Sure.
I think in the relationship, and you got to remember that McClellan and Lincoln met for each other for well over 100 times. And we have no account whatsoever of most of those meetings. So, yeah, we are truly working on a limited amount of
Yes.
information.
Yes.
Or what Woodrow Wilson said, that historians work on a jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing.
Yes. Absolutely. So I want to take us, I think we've got time. I want to take us on a little bit of a tangent. And we don't have to spend very much time out on this tangent, but um when reading this account of Lincoln and McClellan, I couldn't help my mind wandering to Fremont. And Fremont wanders in and out of this study. He can't help it. He's obviously very different from McClellan politically in the way he interprets the purpose of the war. Um, but Lincoln seems to struggle to manage both of them. So I guess my question to you is there a comparison to be made here between both of their partnerships, or am I just kind of off on my own?
I think there's a comparison in the sense that Lincoln found both of the generals difficult to deal with. I think the other comparison is both McClellan and Fremont had strong political supporters. McClellan among conservative Republicans and the Democrats, Fremont among the more radical Republicans, though Fremont's own views tended to go all over the map eventually. I think Fremont would have accepted the nomination of anybody for president by the end. So I think that's one of the things that they have in common, and I think that's important. When you have vociferous political supporters in Congress and out, that creates problems for Lincoln. It creates problems in terms of the allocation of resources. It presents problems when either general runs into difficulty or does something you strongly disagree with. Their political supporters are there. Compare Fremont and McClellan to poor Burnside. General I know a little something about. Burnside was liked by everybody in the Army. No one had anything much bad to say about Burnside. But if Burnside gets into trouble, Burnside doesn't have a coterie of political supporters at his back. He just doesn't have that. So when he runs into difficulty, the politics are not going to be in his favor. Lincoln can do with Burnside whatever he chooses to do with Burnside, whereas McClellan and Fremont, there's limits on what can happen. And I think one of the most interesting parts of the study, and one of in fact, the part of the study I wrote about first in doing this, was the persistent cries to bring back McClellan after November 1862, when he'd been removed from command. I've got a healthy chunk of material in the book on that, and I found it interesting. You have conservative and even some moderate Republicans, and of course Democrats, calling for this. There were rumors all the time that McClellan was coming back. In fact, soldiers in the Army of the Potomac on the eve of Gettysburg had heard reports that McClellan was back in some form or another, and that cheered them up because there remained deep affection for McClellan in that army.
So he doesn't come back. And in the last chapter, you have this example of a minister who claimed it basically says that because Lincoln becomes a martyr after the war, McClellan had to become Lincoln's foil. And in 2024, it strikes me that this still seems to be the case, and you pointed this out, that we need McClellan to be a foil to Lincoln's sanctification, I guess you could say. And I think this is maybe true culturally as and perhaps academically. So why is this? Why do we need the McClellan foil?
Well, I think it makes a good story. I mean, the story of Lincoln and McClellan is a dramatic story that's been told many times. As I said earlier, it may be a story for some people that's set in stone. You know, they don't want to hear anything other than the standard story. And as the late Reed Mitchell pointed out many years ago, Civil War buffs often like to hear the same stories about the war told exactly in the same way. And I think Reed was absolutely right about that. As I worked on the book, I received two general reactions, not only from people I ran into, but from longtime friends. The first reaction was, surely you're not going to defend McClellan. They sort of assumed if I was going to study Lincoln and McClellan, I must be coming up with some horribly revisionist tale that would defend McClellan. And I tried to carefully explain, no, I was not trying to make a case for either McClellan or Lincoln, but rather to examine their relationship and what went wrong. The other reaction was that there simply wasn't much new to say about this. And at times I agreed with that. And at least one reviewer on Amazon still agrees with that, and maybe may have a point there. And so as I struggled with the research and writing, certainly objection number two was with me. Now, academically, what I had done, I chose a very traditional and unfashionable subject. I can't think of a much more unfashionable subject than Lincoln and McClellan in the Civil War field today. I'm sure there were people that saw this book come out and say, oh, well, I'm not going to read that one. Who cares? Especially in trying to look at McClellan. I mean, here's McClellan, a man who seems indifferent to the question of slavery. Again, not a person we normally pay much attention to this day. But I think it's important to remember that many Americans shared McClellan's views on the Union and the conduct of the war. Many did. Many shared Lincoln's views as well. And so I think to understand both men and their relationship rather than critique them was important. And I must say, I've been always amused and somewhat pleased by people who come up and tell me, you know, I like the book, but I still hate McClellan. So, you know, that's fine. And again, I tried to write something that, you know, let the reader decide whether they liked or disliked McClellan or Lincoln.
Yeah, I think the book does a nice job of making both men seem very human and very real, and leaving room to ask questions, but also maybe find a little bit of sympathy for both of them who were in a very difficult situation. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I am delighted to have had this conversation with you.
Been my pleasure, Megan. Thank you very much.